What I'm going to share today is a little lecture in environmental politics, which is the topic that I teach. And I will, I've already put in the chat, but I'll put it there again. Put a link to the website where I have, over the last year and a half since the pandemic, shifted from teaching in person to doing podcasts. So this is what's happened in my university courses anyways. Everybody's course is different. But what I have started doing with a former graduate student of mine who's now a professor at the University of Ottawa is we've kind of gone online with our teaching, and we've been doing interviews with amazing people, academics, business people, civil society activists, who are all working in the area of environmental politics across Canada and around the world. So what I'm going to do is do a bit of a whirlwind tour of the 3 seasons of podcasts that we've developed, and then I will encourage you, for anybody who's really interested in any of the things that I'm saying, you can spend 45 minutes to an hour on every point that I've raised by going to the podcast and listening to the people that we have as guests there. My goal is to kind of introduce some of the material of environmental politics that I work with. Mostly this is content that we've mostly directed to the 3rd and 4th year, but I thought it was appropriate for you guys because you're the keeners, you're the ones who show up for a lecture even when you're not getting graded. And so I figure this is material you can handle and gives you something to chew on. This is material that I use as the basis of class discussions and reading and responses, written responses, in the 3rd year, 4th year, and even in a more condensed form in my graduate classes. So the title of this presentation was Ecopolitics 101, The Difference of 1 Degree. Let me tell you right away that there's a sort of a double entendre there. A 1 degree difference in how much global temperatures rise will make a dramatic difference. But I'm not going to focus so much on the science of that and the technical aspects of that. You can go to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, look at their reports, and they really spell that out in detail. And I think as grade 12 students from across the country, you have been hearing about and thinking about climate change for years, and I think have a pretty good sense of the fact that we really got to address this issue in a big way in the next couple of decades. My goal today is to share some insights about what I've learned about climate politics and about environmental politics more broadly from hosting this podcast series, the ecopoliticspodcast.ca. And one of the things that I think has been neat about this podcast series is that they were all recorded in the context of the pandemic. And almost every episode, our guests make reference to how things are changing during the pandemic, whether it's the rise in the use of plastic, what we've learned about, being able to shut the world's airlines down in a week, what we've learned about being able to put massive state supports into various sectors and to kind of really shifting the way the economy works. There's a lot of interesting lessons that carry over from the response to the pandemic to what we need to think about in terms of the environmental crisis, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and so on. My main message today is that I think there's a lot of hope. One of the things that I've learned from doing these podcast interviews is how many amazing stories are out there, not only about what we need to change, but what people are already doing to bring about changes, whether it's in international diplomatic circles, whether it's major companies that are shifting how they do business, what they're focused on, and whether it's civil society activists who are really making a difference in all kinds of sectors, Indigenous activists who are really taking some leadership roles. So my goal today is to say, we can make a difference. A lot of people are making a difference, and to encourage you to think about yourself in a role of making a difference as well. I noticed that nobody in the intro necessarily said, I'm here for an environmental politics lecture. That's totally fine. I'm not offended by that. But I will tell you that each of you will have a role in environmental politics. And this is because this is one of the defining issues of our time. And so many things about how we do transportation, how we do trade, how we study and meet in, online versus in person. So many things are going to change in the next couple of decades if we are going to meet or get close to the goals of getting to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And so it will affect every sector. And so you will, regardless of what sector you will be working in, you will be helping to make those changes and certainly living through those changes. And so even at the very least, I hope you become aware of that in this conversation and really think about what that's going to mean in the areas that you're going to work in. So I've got 5 main points that I'll share today. First, the environmental crisis is real. It needs to be addressed, and it is being addressed. And I think we need to identify where and how that's happening and amplify and sort of scale out those solutions. What I'm going to do is share my screen. Some of you may have already gone to the Ecopolitics Podcast.ca website and started perusing there, and I encourage you to do that anytime over the course of this little lecture. What I'm going to do is just pop in and point out some of the episodes that I'm talking about. By the way, there's amazing art that we've put together for this podcast series by a guy named Adam Gibbard, and he's drawn a lot of these images from National Archives images here in Ottawa, putting them together in creative ways to kind of speak to some of the themes of this podcast series. Our first season, I think we had 16 episodes, and I'm going to hone in right now on episode number 6, on this idea of we are already making a difference. And this is an episode that featured 2 political scientists, one from the University of British Columbia, Catherine Harrison, the other University of Toronto, Andrea Olive. And it was an episode on federalism in Canada, party politics, and the environment. I'm bringing this forward because I think the example that we have now of carbon pricing in Canada, we've struggled for years to move forward on getting a carbon tax or some kind of carbon pricing mechanism in Canada. It was very complicated. It was complicated because of our federal system, because resources are controlled by the provinces. We have a very unequal distribution of resources across the country. For example, the oil sands in Saskatchewan and Alberta mean that those provinces, have a very particular economic profile. It also really influences the politics in those provinces, as I'm sure you guys well know. And on the other hand, in a province like Quebec, where I'm beaming from tonight, just across the Quebec-Ontario border, with a huge amount of hydroelectric resources, a very different provincial culture. And so the Federation of Canada has had a really hard time getting around developing a common stance on greenhouse gas emissions for decades, frankly, when back through the Kyoto Protocol years, right up to the present day, the federal government has often gone to international meetings, made commitments that it then didn't meet very well, and it had a really hard time getting the provinces on board to meet. And yet, just in the last number of years, the federal Liberal government, this time under Justin Trudeau, in an interesting compromise with the Rachel Notley government when she was in power in Alberta and with the other governments across the country, finally managed to bring in sort of a framework, a national framework for a carbon price that leaves a lot of authority and decision-making at provincial hands, and yet has kind of a common federal backstop, is what they called it. Certain provinces, including Ontario and Alberta, contested this federal policy initiative. They said this is not federal jurisdiction. It went up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada ultimately said, the government of Canada on a major issue like greenhouse gas emissions has the right to determine national policy. I'm bringing all this forward because this is talked about in detail in podcast number 6 with Catherine Harrison and Andrea Olive, and they really get into all those dynamics in the Canadian Federation. But at the same time, I think this is a really interesting story of hope. The carbon price right now in Canada is rather low, and it doesn't have a huge impact yet on how much people drive and what we do with our fossil fuels. But in the coming decades, it will ratchet up significantly. And I think actually it's a really interesting public policy to follow in terms of the behavioral impact it's going to have moving forward. So that's my first example. The second example that I wanted to point to is episode number 3, which is an interview with an entrepreneur named Jay Sinha, who owns a company called Life Without Plastics. My screen is taking a hard time loading because I'm on Zoom. Jay and his family, he had a child who had allergic reactions to certain plastics, and then they started doing research about plastics and realized that a lot of the plastics that we use every day, and our society uses tons of plastic, have potential health effects on some people, especially young children, and then huge environmental impacts, right? You've heard about the massive, quantities of plastics that are polluting the ocean, and predictions that soon there will be more plastics floating in the ocean in mass than actual fish in biomass in the oceans. And Jay took this issue on really seriously and developed a company whose mission it is to provide the products that we use in our daily life, whether it's for containers for lunches, to toothbrush, to all kinds of products that are plastic free. And in this episode, he kind of tells us the rationale of how he got here, why plastics are something to be concerned about, and then goes into talking about how, as an entrepreneur, he's taken on this issue and has turned it into a business. And I think there are so many examples like this across the country and around the world of people taking green ideas, realizing we need to have a different kind of economy that is based on more durable materials, less environmentally damaging materials, and turning them into business opportunities. And as a final note here, I have Jay come into my 4th year global environmental politics class. He'll be coming this coming January. And over the course of the term, my students will represent different countries at a mock UN negotiation table, and they will hammer out a treaty on eliminating plastics in the ocean and reducing plastic use overall across the world. This is all hypothetical, and yet the steps are currently underway to develop such a treaty at the international level, and I would expect to see that in the next 5 or 10 years, that we will actually have an international treaty that first off attacks single-use plastics, and then we'll probably go for plastic use more broadly, pushing for a more circular economy. And the students, maybe some of you who will be in this course in a few years' time, will have had the experience of negotiating that treaty and will be well placed to be part of the real discussions in the real world, which will, like I say, which will happen in the next decade. Okay, my second point. The eco-crisis is not experienced equally by all. And so we really need to take into account the fact that race, gender, and other aspects of social differentiation really mean that different people in the world experience the environmental crisis in different ways. And one of the episodes that we have on this is a theme that runs through many of these Ecopolitics podcast episodes. But we have an episode number 4 in the first season called Environmental Racism and Justice in Canada, where we interview Andil Gosain. He's a prof at York University who teaches courses in environmental racism. And he talks about when he first proposed these courses as a PhD student 20 years ago, he was looked at with skepticism from some of his colleagues saying, environmental racism in Canada, is that really a thing? I don't think so. But the examples are many. Just think about the boil water advisories across so many First Nations communities still in Canada today. Why is it in those communities? There's a whole variety of reasons, but racism and the racial dynamics between Indigenous people and the Canadian state has to be part of the analysis and part of how we understand the problem and thus how it needs to be addressed. Our second guest in this particular episode is Sasna Miranda-Leal. And Sasna is an organizer with Justicia for Migrant Workers. And a lot of this episode, this was recorded in the context of the pandemic, and it focuses on how racialized people in Ontario certainly do many of the 3D jobs: dirty, dangerous, and difficult. And representative of that is the basic labor on migrant farm workers, minimal rights in Canada. They live in substandard housing. During the pandemic, they were more likely than other Canadians to be exposed to COVID-19. They were unable to do physical distancing measures because of the cramped quarters that they lived in. And so the pandemic really highlighted how these social inequalities, how they played out in the context of the pandemic. And then you can also take some of those same lessons and think globally, say about the climate crisis, where the people who are going to experience the climate and are going to experience the climate crisis most severely are those with the fewest resources to really be able to manage it. I know we just went through huge, arguably climate-related events in BC that Tracy's class, I'm sure, knows intimately. Remarkably, there was so much damage and yet limited death. And yet those same kind of events are and will happen in many parts of the world where the death tolls can be expected to be much higher because the situations are so much more challenging. I'm thinking of a place like Bangladesh. And so, or the Pacific Islands like Kiribati that are expected in the coming years to literally be submerged by the climate crisis. So these inequalities need to be paid attention to. And one of the other big themes in these podcasts is the idea that there are also so many lessons from those who are living on the margins of the environmental crisis that we can learn from. And about 6 of these podcasts, or 6 or 7, have Indigenous guests from Canada, the US, Central America, and even from Aotearoa, which is the Maori name for New Zealand. And in fact, I'm just going to pull up the one from Aotearoa, just an example. Episode 2, season 2, episode 10, looks at how there's really interesting dynamics in Aotearoa, in New Zealand, where their reconciliation story between Indigenous people and the state has led to land that was confiscated by white settlers as they came and took over that country in the mid-1800s. Some of that land is now back in Maori hands, and some of that land is in agriculture, dairy farms, beef farms, lamb, and so on. And what's so interesting about that is agriculture, and especially dairy farming, is the equivalent of for New Zealand, what the oil sands are in Canada. The oil sands are a big part of our greenhouse gas emissions. In New Zealand, dairy is 25% of that country's greenhouse gas emissions. Those emissions are in the form of methane that come from cows burping and farting and pooping. And Indigenous controlled farms are now leading the way in terms of sustainability solutions, both in terms of developing technologies and implementing technologies that make them as efficient as possible and thus really reduce the emissions per animal or per land unit. And also they're having the conversations about how do we transition out of animal agriculture because of the huge climate impact that's associated with it into horticulture, forestry, land uses that are, maybe net greenhouse gas suckers rather than emitters. And what's interesting there is that and this episode really gets into it, how 150 years after this colonization process, the agricultural industries as a whole are looking to Maori leadership, Indigenous leadership, to help set the chart for, set the direction for the next century as we try, well, frankly, not just the next century, the next 20 or 30 years as we try to move towards net zero emissions in agriculture. Okay, my third point is that if we're going to address the environmental crisis, we really need to make sense of and confront capitalism, which is not necessarily to say that we need anti-capitalist politics, though some environmental activists would argue for that. But we certainly need to understand capitalism. What is it about capitalism that leads to so much environmental impact? And then how do we bring that under some level of broader democratic control? And we have quite a few episodes that deal with this theme in various ways, but I'm just going to point you to the very latest episode that was just released last week, in which we interviewed Diane Sachs, who is the former environmental commissioner for the province of Ontario. So her job was, as a lawyer, to kind of make sure that the province of Ontario, the Doug Ford government, was living up to its environmental obligations. Doug Ford didn't like her doing her job really, really well, and through legislation, he actually eliminated her job entirely. And so she decided to get political, and she is now the deputy leader of the Green Party of Ontario. There's a picture of her. And we interviewed her, as well as this professor, Matt Huber, from the Department of Geography and Environment at Syracuse University, who is essentially a Marxist geographer who has written books basically trying to understand, how does capitalism work? Why can it be so destructive? Are there ways to make it more sustainable? And interestingly, we asked them, we got quite a provocative picture here, so I'll show you that. That's what Adam did for this particular episode. We asked both of our guests, can capitalism be sustainable? And we expected at least one of them to say, well, no. But what was interesting is both of them said, in principle, yes. But we really then need to do a lot of work to build the democratic institutions to ensure that capitalism is regulated such that it actually is sustainable, because the natural inclination of capitalists is to take profit where they can get it, right? And so it's a matter of really ensuring that there's that capitalists and capitalism is working within a structure, I would say a regulatory structure, that has strong democratic institutions associated with it. Maybe this is my chance to say that everything that I've been talking about very quickly, federalism, for example, you will, if you come to the political science program at Carleton, you can spend years and certainly several courses really understanding how Canadian politics work and how, why is federalism challenging in the Canadian context? How is it different from, say, how it is in Australia or in some other countries? What are the pros and cons of this political model? And then how, I also talked about the carbon tax and the carbon pricing framework in Canada is a very innovative public policy, and we have a variety of courses in our program that allow you to really do public policy analysis. What makes for good public policy? How is it developed? How do you evaluate whether it is successful or not? And similarly, we have courses that get into some of these big questions about, is capitalism sustainable and how could it be? And these more kind of theoretical questions about what do strong democratic institutions look like? For the sake of the environment, I and our guests like Diane Sachs, she worked in a context through the environmental commissioner's role where there was a lot of emphasis placed on the idea that citizens should have rights to be able to demand a clean environment. So the idea of environmental rights. which is something that we talk about in some of my courses. Okay, my fourth point, the global politics of the environment. We have a whole series here on global ecopolitics, season 2. And I'm just thinking about which one. I think I'm going to just introduce you to sort of a provocative idea. One of our episodes, I interview Professor Joseph Mbaiwa. He's a professor from the University of Botswana. I'll pull you his picture up here. Alongside Professor Chris Brown, who's a colleague with Vandana and I in political science at Carleton. And the episode focuses on elephants in Botswana and the question of elephant hunting. What's interesting is that across the African continent, elephants are in decline, and it's a real issue and it's a real problem, and it's got to be dealt with by states across the African continent. However, in Botswana, the particular country in Southern Africa where Joseph Mbaiwa lives and works, elephant populations are actually stable, and in some cases in the last number of years, in some parts of the country have been on the rise. And what this episode gets into is the fact that international conservation groups and animal rights groups from the global north have come into Africa with an agenda that says every elephant needs to be protected. Every elephant is sacred and should never be hunted. And instead, perhaps the only thing that should be done is tourists should come in and take photographs of them. It sounds great, but there's actually, whether hunting tourism takes place in a community or photographic tourism actually supports two very different sectors of the economy within Botswana. One president ago in Botswana, they developed, there was a president who was very friendly with the photographic tourism folks and very friendly with the international conservation groups. And he brought in a ban on hunting that also had associated with it what was interpreted as a shoot to kill policy for poachers, so that the army and the government and police could actually shoot human poachers of elephants in order to protect the elephants. Professor Mbaiwa and Professor Brown both bring some really interesting analysis forward that says that this really did not necessarily help the elephants of Botswana. It helped certain parts of the economy at the expense of other parts of the economy, and was far from democratic. And they together in this episode really argue that we need to, and this is the main message that I take from this case study and several others in this series, there is no one size fits all solution when it comes to global environmental challenges. Biodiversity is shrinking around the planet. It needs to be addressed in so many different ways, in so many different contexts. And yet, assuming that, say, we should never kill another elephant is the answer that we need across the board, may just not be appropriate in a country with a large population, a rural population that depends on its relationship with the animals as well as its relationship with the land. And so if you're curious, if anything I've just said kind of shocks you, or you're like, I really don't know if that makes any sense, listen to this episode and then write into us and tell us what you think. The very last theme that I want to touch on today is the idea of eco-citizenship. And this is our first episode, our third episode of the Ecopolitics podcast series is on what we call everyday ecopolitics. And we're really asking the question, but what can we do as individuals to be part of, solutions that make this world a more sustainable place? In this particular episode, Kimberly Nichols, points out some really interesting information about, if we take the IPCC report seriously, and if we really want to work within carbon budgets, we're going to have to cut down our use of how much we drive and how much we do a lot of things. And she points out that there's a differential responsibility, right? Those who are in the global north, or rather, anybody who earns over $30,000 US a year is part of the top 10% of income earners on the planet. Now, I know you guys are probably not in that bracket, but some of your families probably are. Certainly most Americans, most Canadians are, but it makes you realize like that threshold of $30,000 to be in the top 10% of income earners on the planet puts an extra responsibility on those of us who land in that group, and I'm certainly in it, to really think about our consumption patterns and how we can change our consumption patterns to encourage more sustainable ways of living in general. But both of our guests in this episode are also say that it's not just about consumption patterns, it's also about how we engage politically. And Manvi Bala, she's 24 years old. She's about to come out actually to BC to be a PhD student at UBC, I believe. She was a master's student in Waterloo when we interviewed her for this episode this past summer. And she points out that to be an eco-citizen isn't just about your consumption patterns. It's not just about voting and thinking about the environment when you vote, but it's actually about organizing in your community with the people whose voices and whose perspectives matter as we try and develop sustainable solutions moving forward. And she comes out of Toronto, out of a community of color, and she says, and a rather impoverished community, and she says these are folks who are working really hard day to day just to get by. They don't necessarily have the time to engage deeply in politics and environmental politics or any other politics, but they do care, they do have opinions, and most importantly, their perspectives on which policies are going to work in their communities are as important as everybody else's, right? Certainly as important as the rich people's perspectives on those things. And so she points out that citizenship and eco-citizenship is also about developing the tools for bringing other voices to the fore and informing public policy decisions from that perspective. So let me just kind of recap these 5 points that I wanted to bring to your attention today, and then I'm happy to get your questions. First, the environmental policy crisis is very real, but fortunately it is being addressed, and in so many ways, in so many parts of the planet. I invite you to listen to these podcasts and kind of be inspired by a lot of different stories that are out there. Secondly, the environmental crisis is not affected. Everybody does not feel it equally, and so we really need to bring in what we talk about as an intersectional lens, where we're paying attention to axes of differentiation like gender, race, where we are on the planet, north, south, and so on. Third, that we do need to really understand capitalism and how it works, how it can be so destructive, what are the ways that it can be brought to do more benign work or even environmentally beneficial work, and how to kind of channel that through public policy and democratic institutions. Fourth, that when it comes to the global politics of the environment, all of the countries of the world do need to work together, but the solutions are not necessarily on a variety of issues. And I just brought up the example of elephant hunting in Botswana, are not going to be the same everywhere. So we need to recognize that a diversity of approaches, regional and national, state appropriate responses are going to be part of the answer here. And finally, this idea that eco-citizenship matters, that it's about more than consumption, more than just about voting, but also about helping to organize, organizing divestment campaigns and that kind of work that will all make a big difference as we move towards a net zero world. So just to close off, these are challenging times, and the folks in BC know what that looks like in a very real way. There will be many more catastrophes in the coming years and decades, and lives will be lost, communities will be wiped out, and we need to, go into that with eyes wide open, and try and make a difference. At the same time, Manvi Bala points out in this episode that don't burn yourself out, don't take it all on as your personal responsibility. Carry the ball for a while and then pass it on to others as you take on the challenges of the world and do what you can. But in this time of challenge, it's also a time of immense opportunity when so many things are going to be changing between now and 2050. And this is your generation. You will be part of it. You'll be helping to make those changes. And so there's so many ways that the kind of skills you can develop in a program like political science in terms of public policy analysis, understanding Canadian politics, understanding international politics, understanding how institutions work and how they can regulate capitalism. Those are skills that you can take in a variety of directions to make a difference in the coming decades. Whether it's using those skills to further renewable energy, sustainable agriculture and food systems, institutional design, building codes, and so on and so forth. There are roles in the private sector, in the public sector, and civil society. So there's many places you can take this toolkit. And I guess I've got to put in a plug. These are all skills you can learn and develop as you, if and when you join us in political science at Carleton. And if you do that, I'd love to have you in my courses in the coming years. And I'm just going to end it right there. And I welcome you if there's any questions that anything I've said raises for you. You can put it in the chat or unmute yourself and bring it out that way.
So there was a question from Matea in the chat, which I've answered partly there, about whether we offer any courses that explore how indigeneity intersects with sustainability. And that's a great question. I tried to answer it to some extent, but perhaps Peter, you can elaborate a little bit more on where those topics sort of intersect in some of the courses that may be available to students.
Yeah, sure. Well, certainly it's a big theme in my course and my courses, and I do that, as sort of a white settler, a first-generation immigrant to this country who realizes that I've come into a treaty context, and I really need to understand the history of colonialism in Canada and how that relates to the work that I do in environmental politics. And you'll find increasingly in all the courses across Carleton, there are efforts by profs to bring in Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous speakers and so on. Carleton also has a great Indigenous studies program, Indigenous and Canadian studies program, with courses that you can take as supplemental courses. There is Ojigwanong is the sort of an Indigenous center on campus that is especially welcoming to Indigenous students, but all other students can go there as well to kind of learn and be part of events on these kind of issues. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Oh, and I think we do have, it's not taught every year, but there is an Indigenous politics, a North American Indigenous politics course in our program.
Yes, there is. There's a couple actually. I'm just going to post a link here to some of the Indigenous Studies program, and that's something that students can combine with a political science major, and can combine Indigenous Studies as a minor with their studies as well. So that's another way you can kind of focus on specific areas that we may not teach directly in political science, that may be part of certain courses, but not a number of different courses that kind of fit together. So this offers you a chance to kind of focus on an area of particular interest that's in other departments. And that's part of the bachelor's program, trying to give you an opportunity to get a breadth of knowledge. So, you're obviously taking lots of courses in political science, but you also have the opportunity that you can, study other topics in other departments and in other faculties even. So it makes it a lot more interesting, and you can really tailor your degree to what what your passions are.
Yeah. If I could just do another plug, I've got a couple of several really great Indigenous guests in the podcast. One is episode 8 of the first season with a Mohawk and Ojibwe scholars and environmentalists from this part of Ontario and Quebec. And then in season 2, I also interview a couple of Indigenous Maya activists from Belize in Central America in episode 2.9, which is really an amazing story they have of sort of efforts to ensure their human rights to a healthy environment in Belize. I just have to let my dog out of the room, but I can still hear you if you have any questions.
Yeah, some of the podcasts that are in Professor Andrée's Ecopolitics podcast series, I've actually used in my third year Canadian public policy course as well. And recommended students to listen to some specific ones as part of their course. So Tracy asked about a standard lesson in first year class, how many students and assessments. So we have 2 different types of first year classes. We have the regular sort of lecture class, which can be anywhere from 100 to 200 students. Sounds like a lot. So usually how those are structured is that you have 2 hours of lecture time. And then one of the 3 hours is in a small tutorial group. So you get a chance to be in a group of 20, 25 students with a tutorial assistant who's usually a graduate student in the department, so that you can really sort of have more discussion and debate over some of the topics. Assignments in a first year class could range from quizzes and in-class tests to written assignments, both short and longer papers. Sometimes some of those assignments may be more interactive. It may involve a presentation in some of the smaller classes. We also highly recommend students take the first year seminar. So political science offers, I think this year we had 5 different topics. The first year seminar is really unique in that it gives you, as a first year student, a chance to take a seminar style course, which is not what is usually offered at the first year level in most other universities. So this is a 25 to 30 students in the first year seminar. And that's where you really get a taste for the much more interactive discussion and debate. You get support for developing skills at the university level, like how do you do research in the library, how do you find sources, how do you write a paper for a university class. So it gives you a chance to get much more sort of hands-on support in your learning. So those are really great courses to take, and the topics are tailored to the specialty of the professors that teach them. So the topics can change, but so you have a range of different topics you can choose from. I think we have one, I'm not sure if it's offered this year, but on Indigenous politics as the first year seminar. So, those topics can change, but it gives you a chance to do those kinds of things. And that may also include presentations or group work. So you can get a really wide range of assignments. I don't know if that answers that question, but if you have any others around that. We try to focus on assessments that really give you a chance to, practice skills that will be useful as you go further in your studies. So I have in my second year class, I have students write short papers, an opinion paper that's based on evidence. I have them do a review of a research article, just one article to read and review it. Look at the research methodology that's used and try to understand and explain how it was used and why. So those are the kinds of assignments that you're typically going to see. Felix says a lot of political science courses in your program at Durham, including political science class and Canadian government. Most of these courses were evaluated by opinionated papers. So opinion essays, that depends on the instructor and on the specific course. So, we try to, clearly there's lots of role for people to express their opinions in courses, political in politics and politics courses. And so I think the focus on the writing is really on informed opinion. So, clearly there are many issues where there's no obvious right or wrong answers. And so the focus is really making a case for a particular position or a particular alternative, using evidence and reasoning to arrive at your recommendation or your position. And so that's the kind of writing that we try to encourage. So it's not just sort of expressing an opinion, but rather how do you arrive at an opinion? How do you build the case for one with research evidence, with informed opinion, with a strong, well-crafted argument? Peter?
What I could add there is we also, you'll find you're going to be asked to do different kinds of writing, different kinds of oral presentations. Some that are more opinion-based, some that are about really analyzing the relationship between, two variables, two factors. How does this influence that? You will get training in some courses in how to prepare a policy brief, so that if you're working in government, how do you get the minister what they most need to know about this issue in a 2-page briefing that tells them the key facts, the policy options, and here's the recommendation based on this information, all of it well cited, so that you can give them what they need to know to be able to make a decision with limited time on their hands. So you'll and just as an example of presentation styles, in my 4th year course, students are now doing what they call Pecha Kucha presentations, which is they're presenting with 20 visual slides behind them, which they present 20 seconds each. So it's a 6-minute and 40-second presentation where they talk about, a research challenge, how they are addressing it, and they do the whole thing in just over 6 minutes. Don't expect that you have to do that in the first year, but that's where you will get to over the course of time as you develop these skills.
Yeah, in my research methods class this year, I'm just starting to watch the videos, but I asked students to design a research proposal, not actually do the research, but design a proposal for doing research. And I gave them the option of either writing it up like a report, or to actually do a presentation, to record their presentation and present it as if they were presenting it at a scientific conference. So there's different ways of getting the message across, of doing assignments, and sometimes you'll have different options you can choose from as well.
Okay, we're at 5:30 here, but we'll just stay on for a couple more minutes. If anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to, again, turn your mic on and talk, or pop them in the chat. And then we can get those answers. I am going to post just a couple email addresses in the chat. If you think of questions later tonight, down the road, always feel free to contact us here at Carleton, both in undergraduate recruitment or in the political science department if you've got specific questions about political science, because we're always here to help if you've got questions moving forward in the process. Or if you want to know more about events like this, I can post some of those as well, some of those links, so you can stay up to date with us with events. So as I said, feel free to post any last minute questions in the chat, and I'll just post a couple contact links here for everyone as we go forward.
I'm going to post also I've just posted a brochure that you can download and have a look at. It goes over some of the programs that we offer. It gives you a chance to, get a feel for what the program is like. I've posted my email address, and Professor Andrée has posted his as well. So feel free to send us an email if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to get back to you. I'm also going to post the political science department's homepage links, so you can also explore some of this information in more detail. If you're interested to see what a first-year course looks like, I posted earlier a link to our course outlines archive, so you can actually download a first-year course outline and look at what the readings are, what the expectations are, what kinds of assignments the professors assigned. So you get a really good feel for what the expectations are by looking at some of those, as well as some of the topics that the variety of courses that we offer.
Awesome. Great. So we want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We appreciate your time and energy that it took to come online here. And we hope to hear and continue these conversations with everyone as we move forward in this process. So thank you everyone for logging on, and we hope that you have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Hope to see you at Carleton. And honestly, if anybody has any feedback for me on some of what I shared, just get in touch through email. Love to hear from you.